Question number 11, the Honourable David Parker.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
I seek leave to carry my question over to another day, given that the Minister who was at Select Committee this morning miraculously is not in the House.
The latter part only damages the point of order that's made. Leave has been sought to transfer this question to the next sitting day. Is there any objection? Yes. There is. Order. I've called the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does he stand by all his answers to written and oral questions regarding the multi-million-dollar payment to the Al-Khalaf Group and the model farm in the desert?
Speaker.
Honourable Paula Bennett.
On behalf of the Minister, yes, within the context that they were given.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Given he claims the previously undisclosed $4 million initial payment to Al-Khalaf was justified to settle his $20 to $30 million legal claim, did he receive any legal advice from Crown Law or his own ministry as to whether Al-Khalaf had any legitimate claim?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
On behalf of the Minister, it's my understanding that it was a contract for services, and I can't answer the question on legal advice because I don't have it with me.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Order. Point of order.
My question...
Order.
Point.
I'm just going to call the member. I've been waiting for the noise to settle down on my left. The Honourable David Parker.
Yes, point of order, Mr Speaker. My question isn't what the legal advice is. My question is, did he receive any legal advice as to whether the claim was legitimate?
And I heard the answer. The answer that was from the Minister answering on behalf is, I can't answer that. So further supplementary.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
The Minister is answering on behalf of the Minister. She should be in a position to answer that question.
Order.
It's germane and central to the issue.
The member may hope so. But on this occasion, as I've said, I think last week, at a time when another member is asking on behalf, I would actually prefer, if they don't have the information, that they're upfront in saying that, rather than trying to stumble with a guess that then proves to be inaccurate. If a member has come to this question and has not got the answer and says, I have not got that information, that addresses the question. Further supplementary? I'll point of order the Honourable
I may have an answer here that might help further if that's of interest to the House.
Well, I think on that basis, the best way forward is I'll invite the Honourable David Parker to repeat the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Given that he claims the previously undisclosed $4 million initial payment to Al-Khalaf was justified to settle Mr Khalaf's $20 to $30 million legal claim, did he, the Minister, receive legal advice from Crown Law or his own ministry as to whether Al-Khalaf had any legitimate claim?
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
Mr Speaker, the answer I have here on behalf of the Minister is I'm advised that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Legal Division provided advice on issues relating to the Food Security Partnership, but I can't answer further than what the Minister
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable
That doesn't address my question at all.
No. Order. It doesn't answer the question to the member's satisfaction. That's accepted. But it certainly addresses the question.
Well, point of order, Mr Speaker.
No, I'm going to give the member... Order. Member will resume his seat. I have ruled quite categorically that question's been addressed. Now, to further take points of order, further take points of relitigating that leads to disorder and means that I have to deal with that far more substantially. If the member has further supplementaries, he's welcome to raise them. Or equally, I hadn't quite finished. Equally, if the member wants to raise fresh point of order, which are genuinely fresh points of order, that is also acceptable. Further supplementary, the Honourable David Parker.
Isn't the real reason that the Minister has refused to answer oral questions, written questions and Select Committee questions on this very issue because he never got that legal advice, but to concede it amounts to an admission that he misled his Cabinet colleagues?
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
On behalf of the Minister, I defute all of the question from the member.
Questions. Supplementary.
To order. Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Is the reason the Minister is now talking about general trade risks rather than Mr Khalaf's legal claim because in truth these payments were to advance the FTA and trading with Saudi Arabia?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
Certainly, Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister, the truth that I have seen is a mess that was left by Labor that this government has had to pick up and actually fix so that we are in a position where we can discuss trade with that partner.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question. The Honourable David Parker.
Isn't the real reason that he continues to pretend the $4 million payment to Al-Khalaf was to settle the non-existent legal claim? Because otherwise it's even more obvious that the multi-million dollar payment was a facilitation payment that in other jurisdictions is called a bribe.
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Paula Bennett.
Mr Speaker, the assertions from the member are wrong and incorrect. What the Minister of Foreign Affairs has done is exactly what this country would expect of him, which is to step up in the best interests of New Zealand and actually fix a mistake that was put in place by a previous government.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Was the Minister surprised that the Select Committee chair this morning allowed him to make his self-justifying pre-written assertions about his past conduct, then ruled opposition questions about the past out of order and blocked opposition members getting to the bottom of this matter?
Order. That is a very marginal question. The essence of it was the Minister surprised by such alleged action? I'll allow the Minister to address that.
Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
You seem to be casting aspersions on my question, which is in order.
I'm very inclined to deal with it the way I have the option of doing. That was a question that was not according to standing order. There was full of allegation, imputation, etc. throughout that question. I decided to be generous to the member and allow the Minister to address it, and we should continue with that. But if that's going to be an issue, I would have not much hesitation in ruling out in the first place.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. You obviously weren't at Select Committee because there was nothing in my question that's contentious.
I was definitely not at Select Committee. Now, order. I'll invite the Minister to complete the answer.
Thank you. Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister, I am seldom surprised these days at the inane questions that come from opposition, whether it be in a Select Committee or in this House.
Question number 12, Todd Barker.